May 2nd, 1957, 10:55 p.m. The lobby of the Majestic Apartments, 115, Central Park West, Manhattan. Frank Costello stepped off the elevator wearing a tailored gray suit and a fedora pulled low. He was 66 years old, Prime Minister of the underworld. The most politically connected gangster in American history. A young man stepped from the shadows, 250 pounds, sweating. He raised a .38 caliber revolver and said 5 words that would echo through mob history. "This is for you, Frank." He pulled the trigger. The bullet entered Costello's skull above the right ear. It traveled under the scalp, around the bone, and exited near the back of his head. Costello dropped to the marble floor, blood pooling, doorman screaming. The shooter, a fat kid from East Harlem named Vincent Gigante, ran out the door and disappeared into the night. Costello was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. The doctors expected him dead by morning. He wasn't. He sat up in bed the next afternoon, asked for a cigarette, and refused to identify his shooter. He simply said, "I didn't see nothing." That bullet, that whispered hit, that survival, would echo 12 years later through a movie theater in Times Square, where audiences watched a man named Marlon Brando playing a character named Vito Corleone. And almost nobody knew the truth. The truth was this: Vito Corleone was not one man. He was 3. He was a Frankenstein stitched together from Frank Costello's whispered voice, from Carlo Gambino's invisible patience, and from Vito Genovese's Sicilian rage. Mario Puzo built The Godfather out of newspaper clippings and FBI leaks, and Francis Ford Coppola brought him to life with 3 real bosses bleeding through every frame. This is the story of how Don Vito got his voice, his patience, his name, and his sins. And this is the story of the man Vito was supposed to be, the man who walked into a Manhattan lobby one rainy night in '57 and walked out with a bullet in his head, still breathing. Here's what the history books gloss over. The Vito you think you know, the soft-spoken patriarch with the cat in his lap, never existed. He was a literary collage. And the real men he was built from were stranger, crueler, and far more interesting than anything Puzo dared to put on the page. Let's start with the voice. That voice.
Instead, you come into my house on the day my daughter's to be married and you ask me to do murder.
Brando's whispered, gravelly, almost inaudible mutter that became one of the most imitated sounds in cinema history. It didn't come from Brando's imagination. It came from a wiretap. Frank Costello, born Francesco Castiglia in Loropoli, Calabria, in 1891, had a damaged throat. As a young man, he'd had surgery on his vocal cords. The operation went wrong. For the rest of his life, he spoke in a hoarse, raspy whisper that forced everyone in the room to lean in. It was an accident of medicine that became a weapon of intimidation. People thought Costello was being deliberate, controlled, menacing. He was just trying to be heard. In 1951, the Kefauver hearings put Costello on national television. The cameras weren't allowed to show his face, only his hands. America saw those hands tapping, fidgeting, gripping the table, while that broken whisper answered questions about gambling, about politicians, about Tammany Hall. The country was hypnotized. 18 years later, Marlon Brando sat in a screening room at Paramount Studios and watched FBI surveillance footage and old Kefauver clips of Frank Costello. He listened. He stuffed cotton balls in his cheeks for the screen test. He pitched his voice down into a forced whisper, and he stole Frank Costello's broken throat for a character that would define American cinema forever. That's why Don Vito sounds the way he sounds, a surgeon's mistake on a Calabrian immigrant in 1909. But the voice was just the beginning. Costello gave Don Vito something deeper. He gave him the politics, the fixing, the hand on the senator's shoulder. You have to understand, Frank Costello wasn't a street guy. He hated violence. He'd done one prison stint as a kid for carrying a pistol, and he came out of it convinced that muscle was a coward's tool. The real power was in judges, in congressmen, in police captains, in the men who wore suits and decided which laws got enforced and which didn't. Through the 1920s, Costello partnered with Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, with Meyer Lansky. He built a slot machine empire that stretched from New York to New Orleans. By 1942, he was the boss of the Luciano crime family in everything but name, while Lucky sat in Dannemora prison. And what did Frank do with that power? He bought New York City. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran Manhattan, was effectively his personal cash register. Judges called him for advice. Mayors took his calls. When William O'Dwyer ran for mayor in 1945, the meeting that allegedly sealed his nomination took place in Frank Costello's apartment. That apartment, the one in the Majestic, the one with the lobby. Don Vito sitting at his desk, granting favors, asking the undertaker Bonacera to remember this kindness, telling Johnny Fontaine that a man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man. That's not Vito Genovese. Genovese would have shot Bonacera for wasting his time. That's Frank Costello, the whispered diplomat, the man who solved problems with envelopes instead of bullets. Costello was Don Vito at the wedding, Don Vito in the office, Don Vito refusing the narcotics deal because, and I quote from the film, "It's a dirty business."
Vice, but drugs is a dirty business.
Costello really did refuse to get into heroin in the late 1940s. He thought it would bring federal heat. He thought it would corrupt the families. And he was right. He was completely right. And that refusal, that stubborn old-world morality about a single product line, that became one of the most famous scenes in movie history. But Costello wasn't the only ghost in the suit. Now we get to the second man. Carlo Gambino, born in Palermo, Sicily, August 24th, 1902, 5 feet 7 inches tall, maybe 150 pounds in a wet overcoat, a nose like a hawk's beak, a voice so soft it barely registered. Gambino smuggled himself into the United States in 1921 as a stowaway on the freighter SS Vincenzo Florio. He stepped off in Norfolk, Virginia, a teenage illegal immigrant with no English and no money. 45 years later, he was the most powerful mafia boss in the world. And almost nobody outside the FBI knew his name. That was the trick. That was Gambino's gift. Invisibility. While Costello was on television and Genovese was screaming at federal prosecutors, Carlo Gambino sat in a small house in Massapequa, Long Island, eating his wife Catherine's pasta, watching television, never raising his voice. He was the boss of the largest crime family in America. He earned an estimated $500 million across his career. And the public didn't know what he looked like until photographers caught him at a wedding in 1970. That patience, that stillness, that refusal to be seen. That's the Don Vito who sits in the dark hospital room while Michael whispers to him, "I'm with you now, Pop." That's the Don Vito who plays in the tomato garden with his grandson. That's the Don Vito who dies of a heart attack with an orange peel in his mouth, surrounded by his family. Because Carlo Gambino did exactly that. On October 15th, 1976, in his bed, in his Massapequa home, with his children around him, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack. He was 74 years old. He had never spent a single night in an American prison for a Mafia conviction. Not one night. The FBI tried. The IRS tried. New York State tried. Robert Kennedy personally tried to deport him in 1966 and failed. Gambino simply outlasted them all. He was sick with a heart condition for the last decade of his life. He carried nitroglycerin pills in a small silver case. When agents came to question him, he'd clutch his chest, and his lawyer would whisk him away. Was he faking? Some say yes. Some say no. What's documented is that he died of legitimate cardiac failure on a Friday afternoon in October. In bed, in peace. Nobody else who ran a New York crime family in the 20th century got to do that. Nobody. So when you watch the scene where Don Vito collapses in the tomato garden, that gentle, peaceful death, that's not a Hollywood invention. That's a steal. That's Mario Puzo doing what writers do. taking the most extraordinary fact about Carlo Gambino, the impossible peaceful exit, and grafting it onto the Godfather, the man who never went to prison, the man who died in his bed, the ghost. But you can't have a Don named Vito without the third man, the man whose name the character actually carries. Vito Genovese, born November 21st, 1897, in Resigliano, a village outside Naples. He came to America at age 15 in 1913. By his 20s, he was running with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello on the Lower East Side. By his 30s, he was a stone killer. Genovese gave Don Vito two things, the Sicilian roots and the dark shadow. Because here's what the movie hides. Here's what Puzo softens. Here's what Coppola frames in shadow but never says out loud. The Mafia in 1948, 1949, 1950 was already deep in narcotics. The famous Appalachian meeting in 1957, the one where state troopers stumbled onto 58 mafia bosses in the woods of upstate New York, that meeting was largely about heroin. Who controlled it? Who profited? Who paid tribute? And the man pushing the heroin policy hardest was Vito Genovese. While Frank Costello was telling the commission that drugs were too dangerous, that they'd bring Elliot Ness twice over, Vito Genovese was building a smuggling pipeline from Sicily to Marseille to New York that would eventually be called the French Connection. He made millions. He killed dozens. In 1957, Genovese decided he wanted Costello's chair. He wanted to be boss of bosses. So he sent a fat soldier named Vincent Gigante to the Majestic lobby. And on May 2nd, that bullet went into Frank Costello's head. Now the irony. Vito Corleone in the movie refuses the narcotics offer from Sollozzo and gets shot for it. 5 bullets in the street while buying oranges. The character's defining wound, the betrayal that launches the entire saga, is a gunshot ordered because he refused to sell heroin. That is, the Costello shooting. Reframed, sanitized, moved from a hotel lobby to a fruit stand. The man who pulled the trigger in real life worked for Vito Genovese. The man who pulled the trigger in the movie worked for Sollozzo, a character who is, in every meaningful sense, Vito Genovese. The real Vito gave the fictional Vito his name and his enemy. He's the dark twin, the version of Don Vito that Don Vito refuses to become, and that's the genius of Mario Puzo. He took the man's name and gave it to the man's victim. Genovese paid for it eventually. In 1959, he was convicted on a federal narcotics conspiracy charge that may have been a setup orchestrated by Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello himself. Some say the three of them paid a Puerto Rican drug dealer named Nelson Cantellops $250,000 to testify against Genovese. The accounts vary on this. What's documented is that Genovese got 15 years in federal prison. He died in the medical wing at the Springfield, Missouri Penitentiary on February 14, 1969. Heart attack. 67 years old. He never saw the streets of New York again. While he rotted, his name walked into movie theaters across America wearing Marlon Brando's face, the cosmic joke of organized crime. So now we have the three men, Costello's voice, Costello's politics, Costello's refusal of narcotics, Gambino's silence, Gambino's invisibility, Gambino's impossible peaceful death, Genovese's name, Genovese's Sicilian fire, Genovese's drug empire that the character pretends to refuse. Stitch them into one suit. Put the suit on Marlon Brando. Cue the Nino Rota score. You have Vito Corleone, the American myth assembled from 3 corpses and 1 survivor. But here's where it gets interesting. Because Frank Costello survived that bullet, and his survival changed everything. After the Majestic shooting, Costello did something remarkable. He retired. He'd been hit. He'd looked into the eyes of Vincent Gigante and felt his life flicker. He decided he was done. He met with Vito Genovese and effectively handed over the family. He kept his money. He kept his Long Island estate. He kept his apartment. and he walked away from organized crime as completely as any boss in American history. From 1957 until his death on February 18, 1973, Frank Costello lived as a kind of mob emeritus. He grew orchids. He had dinner at the Waldorf Astoria with judges. He gave interviews to Peter Maas. He mentored, of all people, Carlo Gambino. The two of them would meet for lunch at the Madison Hotel in Midtown. Two old men, the whisperer and the ghost, the political fixer and the silent boss. They liked each other. They understood each other. They had survived a world that ate everyone else. When Costello died, he died of a heart attack at Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, age 82, 1973. The Godfather had won the Best Picture Oscar 1 year earlier. Costello had seen the film. The story goes, and some dispute it, that he watched it in a private screening and laughed at the voice. He told a friend, "The kid does me pretty good." He didn't sue. He didn't object. He let the myth absorb him. 3 years after Costello died, Carlo Gambino died too, in his bed, exactly the way Don Vito dies on screen. And 4 years before Costello, Vito Genovese had died in his prison cell, the namesake who never got the throne. By 1976, all three men who made Don Vito Corleone were in the ground. The character outlived them. The character is still alive. The character will outlive all of us. Here's what this story tells you about the Mafia, and about the country that made it. Organized crime in America was never one thing. It wasn't Genovese, the killer. It wasn't Costello, the politician. It wasn't Gambino, the ghost. It was all three at once, sometimes in the same family, sometimes at the same table, fighting each other for the soul of the operation. Mario Puzo understood that, so he didn't write one boss. He wrote a composite, a myth, a man who could refuse drugs like Costello, vanish into family life like Gambino, and carry the threat of Sicilian violence like Genovese. The Godfather is so beloved because The Godfather is the Mafia's best self-portrait, the way the wise guys wished they were. Wise, patient, moral, untouchable. None of them were. Costello got shot in the head. Genovese died in a federal cage. Gambino spent his last years gripping nitroglycerin pills and watching cartoons with his grandchildren, terrified of his own heart. The real Don Vito was 3 broken men in one tailored suit, and the suit only fit because the men were dead. There's one final thing worth saying. The shooter, Vincent Gigante, the fat kid from East Harlem who put a bullet in Frank Costello's head and ran. He didn't go to prison. Costello refused to identify him. The case fell apart. Gigante walked free. He went back to work for Vito Genovese. He survived. He rose. By the 1980s, Vincent the Chin Gigante was the boss of the Genovese crime family. He ran it for decades. He pretended to be insane. He shuffled around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself to dodge prosecution. The FBI called him the Oddfather. He died in a Springfield, Missouri prison hospital in 2005. Same prison where Vito Genovese died. The same medical wing. Closing the loop. The man who tried to kill Don Vito ended up dying in the cell that belonged to Don Vito's namesake. You couldn't write it. Nobody would believe it. Vito Corleone never existed, but 3 men did. One whispered because his throat was cut by a bad surgeon. One vanished because he understood that the loudest boss is always the dead boss. One screamed his way into a federal cage and died with his name still on the streets. Together, they made the most beloved gangster in American history. And the bullet that should have killed the whispered one bounced off his skull on a rainy night in May, in a marble lobby on Central Park West, because sometimes even the Mafia can't write its own ending. Frank Costello walked out of Roosevelt Hospital. He lived another 16 years. And every time you hear Marlon Brando whisper, you're hearing a man who took a .38 to the head and lived to grow orchids. That's the real Godfather, not the cat in the lap, not the orange peel teeth. 3 men, 1 suit, and 1 bullet that refused to do its job. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment below. Which of the three men do you think Don Vito most truly is? Costello, Gambino, or Genovese? We're listening.